بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. حياكم الله. First of all, good evening to everyone. On behalf of KFAS, Kuwait Foundation for the Advancement of Sciences, I would like to welcome you all for the KFAS Links Speaker Series events. This is one of our events in which we indulge in different topics related to science, technology, and innovation. We are delighted to have you all with us today. We have a very first of all, if you could join us all together down, there's a lot of space in the first floors. So yes, this is one of the KFAS Speaker Series events that we have in place. We do this every once in a while, and they're all focused on innovation, strategy, and business development. One of the things that we want to make sure that we have in place is that we want to try to provide as much as possible back to the general public. So this is part of our knowledge sharing opportunities for you and to network with others. So try to gain as much as possible during this hour of an event. I would like to present Steve, Professor Steve Walton. He's an associated faculty and faculty director at UCLA Anderson Executive Business School and a professor at Goizueta Business School. Steve's current interests include strategic execution, operational decision making, and the impact of leadership on operation outcomes. We are delighted to have our guest from UCLA. We are delighted to have you with us, sir. And throughout this whole session, we will provide you an opportunity to ask questions. So if you have any question in mind, and keep it with you till the end of the event, we will provide as much opportunity for you to ask and for Professor to give you the answer. So without further ado, Professor.
Thank you. Before I start, I would like to say thank you for inviting me. It is an honor to be with you tonight, and I do appreciate the hospitality that you've shown since I've been here. Thank you so much. What I want to talk about for just a little bit is what we've learned about the brain. It's interesting. We have learned more about how the brain works in the past 6 years than possibly in the previous 100 years. And I want to talk about how what we've learned impacts the way that we think, or at least the way that we think that we think. And it's an interesting thing. I need to start with a bit of a personal story, because one of your friends and colleagues asked me a question a few minutes ago. So I am a business professor. I have a PhD in business disciplines. I am a strategist. I'm a trained statistician. And one of your colleagues asked the question, then how are you talking about the brain? This is a fabulous question. So about 3 years ago, well, maybe like you, I am the quintessential type A person. I've never seen a challenge that I didn't want to take on. And if it was hard, all the better. And if my schedule was full, better still. Because I thought the more that I did, the more successful I would naturally be. Very typical hard-driving personality type. Well, I'd been doing this for several years, as you can imagine, and I live in a city where the traffic is notoriously bad, Atlanta. Some say it is the 3rd worst traffic in the United States. And where I live, in order for me to get to work, I either leave very early in the morning, say 5:30, in which case it takes 20 minutes. Or if I wait until 6 to leave, it can take over an hour. So one of these mornings, I was heading to work, and I had come to a stoplight, and I looked to my left to make sure that no cars were coming. The way was clear. I began to turn, and the car that was actually there that I did not see honked its horn and swerved around me. Now, I won't be dramatic and say that it would have been a horrible accident. I don't control that. But it would have been quite an accident. And I started thinking to myself, how could I have missed that car? It was obviously there. How did I not see it? And it raised some really interesting questions. What causes the brain to focus on a thing? What is the impact of rest and sleep on cognition? What about stress? When we're stressed out, what does that do to what we pay attention to, what we notice, how the brain works? Is there such a thing as good stress? Or is all stress bad stress? And these questions became very motivating to me for personal reasons. And what I realized is when we start making strategic decisions, sometimes our brain gets in the way and we don't even recognize how that happens. And so what I want to share with you is some of what I've learned over the course of the past 3 years. The work that I've been doing has been looking into the research, into cognition, into neuroscience, into various neurobiology disciplines to understand how the brain really works and how sometimes our brain gets in the way. And that's what I want to share with you tonight. I was so fortunate that KFAS has been developing a program that looks at the impact of neuroscience and what we can learn from neuroscience on strategic growth. And UCLA is their partner, and they were kind enough to invite me to come along. So I'm happy to be able to share with you a little bit about the program and then more about what we know about the brain. So the program that I'm so fortunate to be a part of really looks at what does it mean to seek strategic growth through innovation. And the program works across 4 big ideas. What do we know about how the brain thinks? That's the cognitive neuroscience. What do we know about how the brain reacts in social situations? Do we perceive a social threat? And how does the brain respond to that? So that's the social neuroscience. And then we've connected that with a number of business disciplines, looking at strategic management and the tools that we have to do strategic analysis, along with frameworks about innovation. And so the program that we're working together brings these 4 disciplines together to provide practical tools to the participants on how to think about strategic growth. What I want to talk about mostly, though, is what we've learned about the brain, because it's fascinating. It doesn't work the way that we think it does. To really understand the brain, you need to understand really 2 or 3 big ideas. So the first is the brain exists as a structure. So you can think about regions of the brain. For example, the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is right about here. It is the most advanced portion of the brain. It is where strategic choices are made. It is where ethical decisions are made. Moral judgments are made there. Trade-offs are made there. It's referred to as the executive center of the brain. Now, the thing about the prefrontal cortex is it is an energy hog. When it is on, it is burning through the glycogen of the brain. It is exhausting. Maybe you've had one of those days where you feel like all you did was make decisions all day long. And you come home and you say to your spouse, I didn't do anything at all today, but I am exhausted. That's the prefrontal cortex. It is where executive processing takes place. A second structure in the brain, the limbic system. Now, if you could think of the brain like this, the limbic system is right about here. It's a bunch of different components of the brain. The limbic system is responsible, for example, for memory, for emotion, for how we react to different stimulus. So we can think about the brain in terms of structure. But then one of the things that we've learned recently, do you remember that idea of left brain and right brain, and one is the mathematical side and the other is the innovative? It's wrong. It's not true. It's one of the things that we've learned recently. What is true is you can think of the brain in terms of networks. Now, the networks of the brain aren't necessarily connected. So we'll talk about 2 just to give you an example. There is the task-positive network of the brain. The task-positive network of the brain is the portions, there's a little bit of it right here, there's some of it over here, there's a little bit of it back here. So they're disconnected regions, but they work together for problem solving. So when you're trying to solve a puzzle, when you're trying to find an answer to a math problem, when you're trying to work through a hard problem at work, it is the task-positive network of the brain that's active. Now, interestingly, and we'll talk about this in a second as well, when you grab your phone, you turn the task-positive portion of your brain on also. So if you're sitting idly and you're bored and you reach over and grab your phone, you've just engaged the task-positive portion of your brain. Now, the reason why this matters is the task-positive network of the brain sits in contrast with the default mode network. Now, only one of these 2 can be on at a time. The default mode network is a little piece of the brain right here. There's a little bit of it back here and some of it over here. You know, when you're not concentrating on a particular thing, you're just kind of thinking. or when you're not really thinking at all, the default mode is on. Why this matters is creativity and insight come from the activity of the default mode. So one of the things that we've learned about cognition and decision making is if you keep grabbing your phone and you keep the task positive portion of your brain activated, you reduce the odds of having a creative thought. I don't know if in Kuwait you have the stories of, I have my best ideas when I'm out having a run. The reason why is you don't have your phone. The reason why is the default mode is processing, and what it does is it seeks connections across other portions of the brain. So one of the things that we've learned about the structure of the brain is you can think in terms of networks and the implications of that. It's really interesting. Then as well, to really understand how the brain functions, it's not just structure. You have to understand a bit of biochemistry. And we'll talk about really two different biochemicals. We'll start with neurochemicals. The slide is more intimidating than the idea. Stay with me. So if you think about a neuron, a brain cell, think about a neuron as sort of having an arm, and at one end of the arm is a fist. And at the other end of a neuron, the arm again, but instead of a fist, an open hand. And so if you imagine where two neurons come together, what it actually looks like is this. The fist of one coming to the open hand of the other. But they don't touch each other. There's a gap. So how does the signal coming down the neuron cross from the fist, if you will, to the open hand? It's a neurotransmitter. It's a biochemical that causes the electrical impulse to jump across that gap. In order to understand how the brain works, you have to understand a little bit about these neurotransmitters, but just a little bit. There's over 100 of them, or about 100 of these neurotransmitters. They do different things. One just sort of lets the signal cross. Then there's excitatory neurotransmitters. So there's one called serotonin. If serotonin is in that gap right there, it actually enhances your mood. Some are more dampening neurotransmitters, so dopamine. If dopamine is in that gap, it actually creates a calm. So to understand how you think, to understand how we make strategic choices, to understand the brain, you have to first understand the impact of these neurotransmitters. But it gets more complicated. So where neurotransmitters exist in the brain, in that gap right there, you can also talk about hormones. Hormones do things, they signal through the body systemically whether you're hungry or not, whether you should be afraid or not. And these different hormones have different signaling purposes. And I want to call out one hormone in particular because of its impact on cognition and how we think. And the hormone that I want to talk about is called cortisol. Cortisol is similar to adrenaline, except that the half-life of adrenaline, when your body gets scared, for example, you think there's a spider on the back of your neck, your body releases adrenaline. The half-life of adrenaline is about 90 seconds. So 2 minutes later, that sort of rush of the spider is passed. Cortisol is different. The half-life of cortisol is 90 minutes. Once it's in the bloodstream, sometimes what happens is other things happen that continue to excite you, and it leads to a pattern that I want to talk about. Cortisol is a natural part of human existence. And in fact, this top graph is kind of a pattern of cortisol in the bloodstream over the course of a day. And what you can see is at wake-up time, cortisol is at its natural highest. So that first cup of coffee that you have thinking you need it to wake up, that might not actually be physiologically true because the cortisol has your body at its most attentive point. You can see over the course of the day, cortisol falls. There's one small change that I would make to the graph. About 3 in the afternoon, oh, there's something magical about the 3s. We'll talk about that in a minute. About 3 in the afternoon, cortisol dips again. Our Hispanic friends, our Latin friends actually have it right. That siesta in the afternoon, there is a physiological reason for that. Then, as you can see, going through the day, cortisol falls until bedtime. And then, again, there's this odd little natural thing that happens right there at 3 in the morning. One of my colleagues back in the United States was describing this to me. This is a long-held evolutionary quirk. We as humans are daytime creatures. Many of the predators that enjoyed us for dinner were nocturnal. So this was actually a survival mechanism. Roll over to make sure the lion is not about to eat you. And what we see is that pattern shows up in humans about age 14. Okay, but this is where things get interesting, and it comes directly back to cognition and how the brain works. So the research, they're still arguing about whether this pattern exists, but the research is clear about this pattern. The pattern that's entitled extreme adrenal fatigue. Now I want you to look at it for a second. I want you to think about the implications of this. Because what you see is the cortisol is never high. It's also never gone. It is a mid-level, constant cortisol stimulation. And this is very common in many organizations. If you feel sort of constantly, mildly stressed out, this might be happening to you. Now think diagnostically for a second about what it might look like. So take this first gap right here, where cortisol is high in the normal pattern, but just kind of in this adrenal fatigue pattern. What's the implication of that? You're actually never alert enough to be fully awake. Do you see the gap? You're never actually fully alert enough to be awake. And then you spend the day, the American expression might be, spend the day walking as if in a fog. Never quite fully awake, never quite fully tired. But look at what happens in the evening. This is where it gets interesting. You remember that little bump up here? For most people, in this normal pattern, that little bump is a small rollover, a bit of a stretch, and right back to sleep. But if you have heightened cortisol, that rollover becomes awake at 3 o'clock. Bam! Wide awake. And it becomes that little voice in your head that sounds like, I need to go back to sleep right now or I won't be able to get up in the morning. And if I don't go to sleep, it's going to get even worse. And the voice gets louder and louder in your own ears. If this happens to you, this could be diagnostic that you're in this pattern. Now here's the implication of this as it comes to decision making and how the brain works. Cortisol turns off the prefrontal cortex. Hear that again. Cortisol turns off the prefrontal cortex. All of that executive decision making that requires the prefrontal cortex, under cortisol stimulation, the prefrontal cortex turns off. Now the implications of this. My neurological scientific friends would argue with the precision of what I'm going to say, but it is correct. When you think about the brain, think about up and forward as the advanced processing of the brain. That's where the executive center is. Think about back and down as more primitive processing. So as you move back and down, you come to the limbic system. As you move further back and further down, you come to the brain stem. The brain stem is responsible for making sure you keep breathing. As you move further back and down, you move to more primitive functioning. In a very real sense, under cortisol stimulation, decision-making leaves the prefrontal cortex and moves back. You're making decisions with a portion of your brain that looks more similar physiologically to a lizard's brain than to a human's brain. So if you think about the implications to decision-making, one way that our brain gets in the way of making good strategic decisions is we find ourselves under cortisol stimulation. It's fascinating. Oh, but then this creates a feedback loop. Here's some of the badness that happens under long-term cortisol stimulation. Again, cortisol is normal when it looks like that. But take a second and look at what's associated with this. Under long-term cortisol stimulation, many bad things happen. Increased inflammation, insulin resistance, which leads to diabetes, impacts to sleep. It turns out if you deprive the human body of as little as 30 minutes of sleep a night, for more than about 5 days, you are working at a capacity that is considered legally impaired. 30 minutes a night. So imagine now you're not sleeping and you're under cortisol stimulation. Now your brain is going to struggle to make executive decisions. It's fascinating. And when you put these together, one of the things that emerges is the idea of mindsets. And this is one of the things that we talk about extensively in our KFAS program. Think about a mindset simply as a set of beliefs, a set of assumptions, a set of preconceived notions that help you understand the world. So, for example, here in this time of Brexit, a Eurocentric mindset versus a Eurosceptic mindset. Those are two different mindsets that allow people to process the world. An entrepreneurial mindset. I was talking with another of your friends here in the program tonight, and she was talking about how she was considering starting a business. An entrepreneurial mindset sees things in terms of acceptable risk. Interesting example that some of my new Kuwaiti friends taught me just yesterday. Every nation has its own national mindset. In America, the national mindset is the rugged individual. In Japan, the mindset is a collectivist mindset. My new Kuwaiti friends were explaining to me that in Kuwait, it is a tribal mindset. They define the way that we see the world. One of the interesting leadership mindsets is a contrast between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. I'll give you a second to look at the slide and I'll describe to you some of the important ideas. In a growth mindset, what you believe is you're born with everything that you'll ever get. My intelligence was at its maximum the day that I was born. My musical talent was at its maximum the day that I was born. My athletic abilities were at its maximum. Whatever it is. A fixed mindset says, whatever my resource is, it was complete and full at the day that I began. And think about the implications of that. If you have this fixed mindset, you don't exert effort to get better because you have a limited pool of ability anyway. And in fact, you got to be careful because if you do something that you're not sure you can do, people might realize that you never will be able to do it. And so this fixed mindset becomes limiting. Contrast that with a growth mindset. A growth mindset says, of course I would be willing to put in an effort because I'll learn something. I'm not limited to what I was when I was born. If I put in effort, I can get better. In the fixed mindset, if you put in effort, it's because you can't. In the other, if you put in effort, it's because you can. You just haven't done it yet. And the implications of this are significant. I mean, look at some of the other things. When faced with a challenge, a fixed mindset tends to give up. When faced with a challenge, a growth mindset says, well, this could be a great place to learn. Don't take the wrong way. A growth mindset doesn't want to fail, but sees failure as an opportunity to learn. And think about what this would mean in an organization or even in a family. Imagine that you wanted to teach, well, another short personal story. I have 3 sons, 16-year-old, 14-year-old, and 11-year-old. And my 2 older sons were in a music competition this weekend. And their team won. I was quite proud. So think about what feedback to the kids would sound like in a fixed mindset. Remember, fixed mindset, you have a fixed pool of talent. It would sound like, you are so talented, well done. Now, what you've done is reinforce the idea that you have a limited pool of talent. Feedback in a growth mindset. I am so proud of the effort that you put in. The effort that you put in allowed you to succeed. Do you hear the difference? Imagine being a manager. Which one do you encourage? Because a fixed mindset will not take risks. Why would they? Whereas a growth mindset will. And so this is one of the ideas that emerges when you put together what we know about the brain. It's quite interesting. Oh, but there's more. So imagine for a second. We'll cut the room right in half. This half the room. Imagine for a second you had 30 dinars and they were at risk. You accidentally left them at the gym, and if you don't hurry back, they'll be gone. Or one of your kids might sneak in and borrow them for the weekend or something. For the other half of the room, you might find 30 dinars. It might be that there was 30 in your pants pocket that you had forgotten about and you find it. Or it could be that you're walking down the street and money. Now you would think that we would react the same way, right? 30 dinars to be lost, 30 dinars to be gained. Say it again. It's called loss aversion. No, we don't react rationally at all to it. In fact, what it feels like is this pain from a loss is almost twice as big as the reward for the gain. Now, this plays out in social neuroscience in really interesting ways. Let me describe a situation to you. Imagine the following. Imagine that you are an important subject matter expert for a mid-sized Kuwaiti consulting company. And your boss has come in and has asked you, we need you to be part of a major presentation to a potentially new client. If we win this business, you will be able to manage the business. Now, it's quite important that we get this right. And you've considered your boss to be a friend and a mentor for the number of, yes, they're still your boss, but you consider them to be a friend and a mentor. The day comes for the presentation, and it only goes okay. I mean, it's not terrible, but it's not good either. And you get back to your office. And about 5 minutes later, the knock comes on the door. Your boss comes in and says, I think we need to talk about the presentation. What's going on in your heart, in your mind, in your body right then? How's it feeling? Does it feel terrible? Why? Can you hear some of the things that the boss is likely to say? Can you hear yourself reacting? I can hear a few things. He's going to question my expertise. Can you hear it? That's a threat to your status. Keep going. What if we don't win the business? I mean, I'm not even sure I'll be able to keep my job. It is a threat to certainty. Oh gosh, if I was going to be the manager, I would have been able to decide what I did. But now with that gone, I'm going to be at somebody else's control. It's a threat to autonomy. Keep going. What if my boss doesn't like me anymore? It's a threat to relatedness. Man, it's not fair. They didn't give me enough time to prepare for this presentation. It's a threat to fairness. And what we know is the human brain reacts radically different, much more strongly to threats than to rewards. More specifically, this model, by the way, is called the SCARF model. Use the acronym. The SCARF model of social neuroscience. When any of these dimensions are put under threat, the prefrontal cortex again turns off. Here's what happens neurophysiologically. Under these threats, again, cortisol is released into the bloodstream. The impact of cortisol in the bloodstream is the prefrontal cortex shuts down, decision-making moves back. The technical term that we've been using in session in this KFAS program is you become stupid. It's not really a technical term, but you know what I mean. Because this part of your brain is no longer working. What's really interesting is this, we could pick any of these. I'll pick status. Let's talk about status for a second. Status has a 300 million year history of driving how creatures behave. There's a Canadian psychologist that talks about the book. His name is Jordan Peterson. His book is 12 Rules to Live By. It's quite an interesting book. He talks about what we as a species have in common with lobsters. Oh, it's fabulous. We share with lobsters the exact same response to social threats, particularly around status. So imagine for a second, two lobsters that are competing for territory. You know they're going to fight it out. but it is not the optimal strategy for either to hurt the other. Right? Think about it for a second. Imagine you had two lobsters that fight to the death. Right? First, it'd be kind of interesting, but imagine two lobsters that fight to the death. The one thing that you know is at least one of them will end up dead. More than likely both of them. Right? Because the other will be injured. So who wins in that case? No, the third lobster that was watching. Do you see what I mean? So the optimal strategy, and if you look at every creature in their dominant behaviors, they're not trying to hurt the other, they're trying to demonstrate dominance. It's only in the rarest of occasions that it goes to actual violence. So for lobsters, they'll pinch their claws, they will fan their tails, they'll try to demonstrate how big they are to intimidate the other lobster away. This is so built into the brain that in one study, they took a lobster that had never seen another adult lobster. So it never had a chance to learn the art of dominance in lobsters. When they put them together, they both entered into the art of dominance. Even the one that had never seen an adult lobster previously. It is baked into our brains. Now here's where it gets really interesting, going back to neurochemistry. When the lobster loses serotonin, that same neurotransmitter that flows in your brain, falls. When serotonin controls mood. When serotonin falls, you can see the lobster just look defeated. He literally tucks his tail and becomes kind of smaller. If you've ever seen somebody walking around kind of like this, that's what they look like. This is fascinating. Give the lobster Prozac, and they perk right back up. Prozac works the same on lobsters as it does on you. This dominance hierarchy is deeply built into our brains. I think it's fascinating. Let's keep going. What I want to do is, for just a couple of minutes, show you some of the impacts of what happens when we think that we're rational, but our brain goes a little bit sideways. I have a video that I want to show you. Right, if you've seen this video, shush, no talking. Because usually in the room some have. But if you've not seen the video, your job is about the players dressed in white. In a minute, I'll start the video, and I want to know how many passes between the players dressed in white. Now, players in white will only pass to other players in white. So you don't have to worry about the cross-jersey passee thingy. The players in white will only pass to players in white. When I start the video, everybody's going to be moving, and the players in black are nothing but a distraction. I need to know the number of passes between the players dressed in white. Ready? How many passes? 17? 16? Sometimes I get 17 and a half. That one's still in midair. I heard some of you laugh. How many of you saw the gorilla? Here. Let me show you the video again. This time, don't worry about counting. Wait for it. It was the same video. I always get accused of having changed the video. How could you have missed the gorilla? Focus. Do we ever do that at work? We become so focused on a thing that we miss something important? But there's a sort of neuropsychological explanation. The human brain does not see what is there, it sees what it expects to see. The human brain does not see what is there. It sees what it expects to see. So if you didn't expect to see a gorilla and one walked across, your brain will just go, not relevant, doesn't matter. Your brain is confronted with hundreds of thousands of signals every second. For example, how many of you notice your socks? See, your socks are sending signals to your brain at this very second, but your brain's like, nope, doesn't matter. How many of you notice the shirt hanging off of your body? Again, it's sending a signal, but your brain decides not to process it. What determines what your brain decides to process? Do you see the challenge? What determines what makes it into the front part of your brain? It's even better. Let's play with this. Oh, yeah.
The monkey business illusion. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. The correct answer is 6.
Yes, 16? Yes. How many of you saw the gorilla? Excellent. Very good. What else happened? Say it again. One girl in black walked off. Did you see it? Oh, wait. What else? The color of the curtain changed. Did you notice that? See, you're so proud of yourselves. I saw the gorilla that next change, it's what you expected to see. Here, how many players dressed in black? What color is the curtain? Yes. Watch her as she continues to the other side. Oh, bye-bye. Watch the curtain. Watch the curtain. What determines the signals that your brain allows in? It's fascinating. It's even better. This is my favorite one. Okay, this is a short video. It's only about 6 seconds. What I need to know is, what does he say? But I want to do this as an experiment. So somewhere right down this line here, this half of the room, what I want you to do is watch the video, tell me what he says. This half of the room. When I start the video, what I'd like for you to do is look away. Close your eyes, cover your eyes, but look away. The same job, what does he say? But I want you to look away. All right. So look away. Y'all ready? Here we go.
Ba, 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 ba.
Here, let me turn the volume up a little bit more. Continue to look away. Let me play it one more time.
Ba, 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 ba.
What's he say? How many people heard ba, ba? Interesting. What did you hear? Da da. Sometimes I get la la. Occasionally gaga. Huh. Everybody close your eyes. So everybody look away.
Ba, 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 ba.
What do you say? You said da-da. Huh. You should see your face. The forehead wrinkly thingy, it's awesome. Here, you haven't seen it yet. but I'm going to mute it. Very good. What is the audio track? Baba. What is the video track? Gaga. The human brain, when confronted with conflicting information, instantaneously resolves it. You just don't know how. And that da-da, it's actually not in there anywhere. Your brain took two conflicting signals and smashed them together and created something completely different. Oh, you haven't gotten the whole effect yet. So let me turn the volume back on. And I guess you know the trick. You should be able to overcome this. See how that works.
Ba 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 ba.
How'd that go? Okay, one more time. Hippie dude speaks 3 times. So here's what I want to do. I'll show you the video one more time. The first time he speaks, everybody eyes open. Then as he speaks the second time, everybody close your eyes. And then open them again the third time. So eyes open, eyes closed, eyes open. All right, ready? Eyes open.
Ba ba.
Eyes closed.
Ba ba.
Open again.
Ba ba.
That is how the brain works. Isn't that great? Here, we're quickly running out of time. I want to give you a chance to ask some questions, but I want to give you one quick warning. Because the way to get to this, the way to overcome some of these from a leadership perspective is asking better questions. One of the things that we do is we teach the class, what are some things that you can do? So questions like, how do we know that? It's a very powerful question. Simple question, but a very powerful question. And one of my favorite questions, and feel free to take it and use it, is the question, what does that really mean? Sometimes we find ourselves in conversations where we think we're talking about the same thing, but we're actually not at all. And I wanted to tell you, as sort of the last thing, so we have some time for questions, one kind of embarrassing story on myself. I was teaching at the Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena, California. JPL is the group that sends stuff to Mars. And even more impressively, they hit it. The stuff actually gets to Mars. It's an amazing place. I don't know if you've seen the movie The Martian. That's the Jet Propulsion Lab. Well, as I was teaching there, it was a business class about strategy. And it was appropriate in the flow of the class for me to ask the question, you know what SWOT analysis is? So what is SWOT analysis? Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. And so we continued, and they started asking questions. Well, I have been a college professor for 25 years. At this point, most of the questions that I get are variants of questions that I've heard previously. Occasionally, I'll get a newer question, but most of them I've kind of heard before. They started asking questions like, I've never heard. And I'd start to answer, and they looked at me like I was crazy. I couldn't figure out what was going on. And this went on for about 3 or 4 minutes, and it was clear I was not going to make contact. First contact, that's another thing. And so I finally said, let's talk about this at lunch. What I actually meant was, let's never speak of this ever again. But over lunch, I had a chance to take a tour of the museum and came across this picture. Surface, water, and ocean topography? What is that? Asking better questions helps you get past some of the biases in our own brain. And with that, that's what I wanted to share with you. We'll open the floor for questions. If you have a question, notice that there is a handheld microphone. Please hold down the red button. That will allow everyone to hear your question. Yusuf, we have about 5 or 10 minutes for questions.
Well, we'll try to give as much as we can
Perfect.
opportunity for everyone to ask questions, but because of limited time, we'll try to kind of balance it. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand, and we'll just tell you to use the mic and to go ahead. So the floor is open. We'll start with the lady.
Okay. Okay, good evening. So you said that the cortisol is at its peak in the morning, but it also turns off the frontal lobe. Does that mean that we shouldn't be making decisions in the morning? Because that's when usually people, they take their important meetings in the morning because they're more fresh and supposedly they're more alert. So
this is a great question. The more precise way to think about it is there's a natural flow of cortisol. Let that go where it goes. However, when the body feels threatened, it releases additional cortisol. That's where bad things happen. So if you're following sort of the natural cortisol pattern, it turns out there's another really good book. It's called Essentialism by Greg McKeown. In this book, Mr. McKeown talks about do the hard stuff first. And this is actually really good advice cognitively. Your brain is at its sort of peak first thing in the morning. So the issue is that extra jolt of cortisol that turns off the prefrontal cortex. That's a more accurate way to say it. It's a great question. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi. Thank you very much for the presentation. I just have one question about the slide with the mindsets.
Yes.
Growth and fixed. The question is this fixed?
That's
not
a
as in, is it a fixed mindset, but can you fluctuate between the decision that you're, whatever you're confronted with? You can have a growth mindset in one area and a fixed mindset in another.
It's a great question. The more precise way to say it is mindset is a choice. Mindset is a choice. A person can decide how they want to approach a particular situation. Now, what the original researcher was Carol Dweck at Stanford University. What she would argue is a growth mindset is always a learning mindset. A fixed mindset is always a risk avoidance mindset. So she would argue that in virtually every context, the growth mindset is the more productive one. To me, the interesting part of your question is you actually get to make a choice about which mindset. When a situation comes up, do you view it as a threat or do you view it as a chance to learn? It turns out that's a choice. Good, thank you. Yes, sir.
So the graph that you showed, the one that spikes up a bit at 3 a.m., what time are you supposed to go to bed for that to happen?
This is a great question. So, true or false? What matters for setting your circadian rhythm is what time you go to bed. True or false? It's absolutely false. Circadian rhythm is set by the time that you get up. So what matters more is to sort of fix your wake-up time. Now, the ideal would be to back up 7.5 to 8 hours. The human body requires between 7.5 and 9 hours of sleep, except for about 2% of the population that has a gene that allows them to get by on 6 hours of sleep. You're not all in this room. So the better way to put it is decide what time you need to get up and keep it at that spot, give or take an hour, even on weekends. Now, this is the hard part. Some of you may have jobs where you're up at 5 in the morning through the week and then sleep until 8 on the weekend. It's called social jet lag. Think about what happens. Over the course of the weekend, you've trained your body as if you've gone 3 time zones over, so that then on Sunday morning when it's time to go back to work, it is as if you've just traveled in from 3 time zones. So the better way to think about it is to best manage sleep, because sleep has huge implications to cognition, is decide what time you need to get up, fix it within plus or minus an hour or so, and then try to go to bed so you get about 7.5, 8 hours of sleep. That's really the target. So the research that I did took me into exercise, into nutrition, into cortisol stimulation, into sleep, into mindfulness, into meditation. It turns out meditation mindfulness is one of the most powerful things that you can do physiologically. Physiologically, I use that word on purpose. Mindfulness, what the research shows is a typical person spends about 60+% of their time either thinking about the past or the future, which means that only 40%, less than half of the time, are you in the moment now. You can't control the past, nor can you control the future. This time spent not in the now is associated with elevated cortisol. So it turns out that one of the things that you can do to make your body better is actually to stop and pay attention to your breathing. We used to think of it as this kind of touchy-feely, soft, go do yoga thing. It's not that. It's actually important for the biochemical balance in your body. We have time for one, maybe two more questions.
Yeah, I just want to know.
Yeah, push the button.
Yeah. Does the decision making differ when you're in a different company, like with adults and with children?
Does decision making change when you're in different contexts?
Yeah, with adults and with children.
Do you mean, do kids make decisions differently than adults, or do you mean, do we as adults make different decisions when our kids are around?
The company. The surrounding.
Yes, the surrounding is everything. If you're in a high-stress environment making decisions, so imagine you're in an incredibly competitive company that works very hard hours, what's that going to do? There might be a threat to your social status. There might be a threat to certainty, scarf. And if all of those threats are in place, then cortisol goes up, decision-making moves back in the brain. The more stressful the context, the more likely it is the lizard portion of your brain is working. Yes, sir?
To build on that, how do you avoid taking conformative decisions, so avoiding conformity in decision making?
Avoiding conformity.
Yeah, like in that decision, so you're in a social setting,
Uh-huh.
and you want to take that right decision, but you are pushed to conform. So how do you avoid that, knowing that, maybe that decision could be harmful to you?
Yeah, so this brings in a whole nother body of research that looks at personality and social styles. I'm not sure. That one is such a personal thing that, like I said, brings in social psychology, which actually is a little bit beyond my expertise. And I could make something up and you'd believe me. But that just doesn't feel like the right thing to do.
We have more. So, Professor, would you recommend for a business setting that decision-making bodies within a business be as diverse as possible? So, male, female, older, younger, educated, non-educated, or not highly educated. Would that be a good mix for a decision-making body within an organization based on your study?
It's a great question. The way that I think about decisions in, oh, look at me. The way that I think about decision-making in organizations is the first thing you have to diagnose is what is the type of decision that you're making. Therefore, what degree of collaboration is required. In some decisions, it is just to the executive to decide. Right? I don't need a collaborative body if the choice that I'm making is whether you lose your job. Right? That is a choice that belongs to the leader. If there are hard strategic decisions that you need to create buy-in across the organization, then what you describe is exactly right. If it's a large strategic decision that if the organization doesn't buy into it, it will be hard to implement, then the more collective the group that has input, the better. Now, one of the challenges is when you look across organizations is maintaining clarity of decision rights and decision accountability. Who is responsible for making the decision? Who gets fired if it goes badly? The bigger the group becomes, the more diffuse decision rights and decision accountability risks becoming. So if you're going to bring together a larger team, one of the things you really want to focus on is clarity of decision rights.
Good afternoon. Before I ask my question, I feel like I just have to explain it a bit because it's like I feel like it's confusing. There are these instances, like every now and then, where I'd have like 3 or 4 decisions or opportunities, let's say, and I try not to be biased. Like I try to
give up. We as a species are naturally biased.
Yeah, so I try not to be, and I like would weigh out the pros and the cons and everything, because I want to make the best decision possible. But like after I do that, I find myself like not being able to make any decision because I could argue for like, like to go forward or against any other one. So like in that case, how do I approach the situation?
It's a great question. The thing that you describe is called decision fatigue. The brain has a limited amount of energy to make decisions. Once you've made as many decisions as your brain can make, it's done. It can make no more. The brain is not a muscle, but you can think about it like a muscle that can be exhausted. So then the best choice is to defer a couple of things. Go get a Snickers bar. Have you seen the commercials that they run? You're not you when you're hungry? Yeah. There's actually a physiological truth to that. You've exhausted the sugar in the brain, fill it back up. The other is, so one is replenish the brain, the other is rest the brain. So what I would suggest is sequence the decisions so that you leave enough space for the brain to recover. Similarly, there's an idea called ego depletion. Apparently, the brain only has so much ethical decision-making in it as well. And when it's gone, it's gone. The research that they did is people who buy organic foods are more likely to park in the handicap parking place. It's as if they've done their one good deed and they're done.
Thank you very much for an excellent presentation, and you have such an engaging style. I think the core issue regarding decision making, but my question is regarding the 3 a.m. Kickoff time. You've mentioned that how it cycles actually through the different stages. But my question was, has this research has been repeated at different times, and how many times has been done? One thing we have, for example, in religion here in Kuwait, or I mean in general in Islam, we don't have to link everything to religion. We are mostly here come from science background. You mentioned that at 3 a.m., for example, if we look historically, we can link this to the predator kind of, wake up and maybe there is kind of a risk, an external risk. This can happen, but I think in your research, this has happened in, a new environment. I mean, modern environment, not in the jungle or whatever. So I would actually question how the researchers came to that conclusion that this is regarding the predator kind of threat. That's one. Second thing, for example, in Islam, we have a kind of prayer at summertime, which is almost 3 a.m., but it actually changes in winter time. It can be up to 5 a.m. To what extent do you think the explanation about the kickoff and 3 a.m. actually related to the predator, issue?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So it's a great question. So the first part is these studies into cortisol and sleep patterns have been replicated by many different universities and scientists. The pattern holds. The challenge is that there's no way to experimentally explain why the 3 a.m. thing. So what that reflects is the scientists' best understanding of what is the most likely cause of that. And because it shows up at about 14 years of age, about the time that the species would become a hunting member of the pack, if you will, the best explanation they've come with is that it's evolutionarily based as part of a protective mechanism against prey, or against predators. But it is by definition their best understanding. There's no evidence that they can bring to bear against that. So that is the most honest answer that I can give you, is there is no specific evidence that says this is genetically related to predators. It's the best explanation they've got.
Just in respect to the time, and I appreciate everyone's interest in asking questions, I'll just call it off for the time. And I'll just mention one thing is that I'm really happy that we have such a great crowd today. I'm thankful for everyone and single one who joined today, participated and was fully engaged. And I would like to thank you, sir, for being with us. It's been a highly engaging presentation and session. So on behalf of KFAS, on behalf of everyone here, thank you very much.